Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first in many of a series of videos, Reimagined, a Hidden Compass YouTube series. I am your host, Lauren Eckerts, and I am thrilled to be joined today by Kirsten Dobler. Kirsten is an Indigenous academic and language revitalizationist, a passionate educator of settler and Indigenous ancestry, and an all around super inspiring, rad human. Her pronouns are she, her, and she is of the Liquidao peoples. Welcome, Kirsten.
Yo, Gaila Kessa, Nuga Kirsten, Aguk Lamas Klun, Gaiklin Lacht, Akaluten, Glu Hwasam, Glu Gwai, Glu Lachalis, Glu Yulap, Ligwistauch Un, Gilkulin Lach Klama Tau. Gaila Kessa, thank you so much for having me. I come from many places in the Kwakwaka'wakw Nations. I'm Ligwistauch, meaning I come from the lands of the Likwala speaking people, and it's really great to be here.
Amazing. So, Kristen, you're videoing in from your classroom. Can you tell us a little bit
Mhm.
before we get into the topic for today about what you do as a teacher?
My current job is a Kwakwala immersion teacher. I started learning my language a couple years ago, working really closely with a few of my aunties, Mayanith and Katnasamagya and Goixislas and Akwaskams, all in Klamatau in Campbell River, what is Englishly known as Campbell River. Before that, I lived in the Gakatla Nation, and I was a teacher there for a couple years. And if I didn't have a home, I would still be there because I really, really love everybody up there. I graduated from Bishop's University in education about, I guess, 2017. And then in 2018, I guess. That was a quicker turnaround than I thought. I started my master's degree at the University of Victoria in the Masters of Indigenous Language Revitalization program. And I had some really excellent professors and some really good role models, and it just felt right to come home. And so here I am. I'm going into the third year of teaching in this Kwakwa immersion program. And teaching in a public school comes with a lot of challenges,
Mhm.
but our kids are really, really awesome,
Yeah.
and I get to spend every day with our kids, and I get to model for them how much language is important and how much I love it, and it's really a really big gift.
That is beautiful. What an awesome further detail to your introduction and insight, a peek into your day to day and your long term goals. So, we are gathered today in this virtual space to talk about something that you and I have certainly chatted about before, or raged about before, various types of conversations about before. And that is about exploration. What exploration means in a modern era, if exploration is possible in decolonial frameworks that support, indigenous peoples reclaiming access to their territories and their stories. And Hidden Compass as an organization is at this interface of so many spaces, is looking to combine storytelling and science and travel journalism and ethics and big picture stories with the individual stories that we all lead and tell. And so for the first four episodes of the Hidden Compass Reimagine YouTube series, we want to begin by meeting each other at exploration, at what exploration means, what it's meant, what baggage it might carry, and what it can mean. An exploration of exploration, if you will. So, to get things started, I just want to give you the floor to talk about what that word means to you. Interpret that however you wish.
Whoa, that's a big one. That's really interesting. So in recent years, so I grew up in Powell River, in the Common territory, and I didn't grow up close to my culture or my family. And when I was 20 years old was the first time I learned about residential school. And I had always felt really loved by my family, but I didn't spend a lot of time outside of holidays. But like always, like deeply loved by my aunties. And I think that's part of the reason I was able to come home. But when I was 20 years old at Bishop's University, I learned about residential schools for the first time. And it was like there was a light bulb in my head, and it was like, oh, like things make sense. And there's a lot of actions that have happened that are results of colonization that aren't acceptable, but it makes sense why there are certain patterns in certain parts of my family. And it makes sense on both sides of my non-indigenous and my indigenous family, because colonization has deeply impacted everybody in like mostly negative ways, which I'm sure that's something that a lot of people are coming to terms with. And so, in that time of my life, in my undergraduate degree, I learned a lot. Well, because like that's what you do in your early 20s. You're just learning like tons and tons of things, but more about the true history of Canada than I'd ever been exposed to. And when I think of exploration, the term that goes into my brain is like terra nullius. And if you're someone who's done maybe the blanket exercise, or you've done work in exploring the true history of Canada, terra nullius is a term that you've probably come up against, and it means empty land. And so, what I was always taught in school was that explorers came here to this empty land and they made use of it. And it's really not true, but it's what was pushed on us from a very young age. And it instills that patriotism, and it brings Canadians close together. And that's all for the goal of colonization. And colonization itself is like a synonym with exploring, because and then add in conquer, and they all sort of layer onto each other, and that's rooted in white supremacy. And so like we'll like pedal back from that for a minute, because like it's kind of a boom, but they're all so deeply intertwined. And when it comes to exploration, there's a lot of pride that comes with that was pushed. There's a lot of pride that was pushed with exploration. And as I've become more myself, and as I've learned about my people and my culture, and really have like started to ground myself in like who I am really, it comes with an unease. The word explore and exploration, and even in the classroom, it's like, oh, we'll have kids explore this, and it's like kind of just a cringy word for me now, where it's like, like it just its deep relation to it, to colonization, is really what like turns me off from the word explore, and to even just like imagining like exploring places. And like for me personally, it's really curtailed a lot of travel, because I'm asking myself now, like, am I going to be able to move in a good way? And if I'm going to be a tourist somewhere, is this something that the people of those lands have consented to? Because all over the world, there are indigenous people, and we're all indigenous to somewhere, which is a gift, really, us all being indigenous to somewhere. And knowing that wherever we come from, whether we're second generation Canadian or 12th generation Canadian, there is somewhere, there's land that you belong to, and there's land that deeply connects to you. And that's something that I don't know that a lot of Canadians are there yet. Because, and that's a way that colonization has really negatively impacted Canadians, is taking them away from their ceremony. And in a lot of cases, there was people came over to Canada and to North America, so-called Canada and so-called North America, because it wasn't going well in their home country, which is reasonable. But at the same time, the original people coming over to conquer and to settle, like that stems back further than our nonas and nonos who like came over from Italy because there was hard times. Like that stems back further than people who are immigrating here now. And those situations are actually quite different than the exploration and the conquering than the colonization that happened. And so one of even exploring makes me think of like where was that shift in time? Like these are the conversations that like I feel like we're getting to. It's like, but like we maybe don't even have answers to. It's like where was that shift in time? But we can't control any of that, which is kind of like, okay, then what? And it's like then we need to start taking responsibility, and
Mhm,
we need to start
mhm.
saying like, oh, I'm going to go explore South America, and like I really want to travel and explore South America. And it's like, okay, but how are the people down there? Like, how are the indigenous peoples?
Yeah.
Like, how are they? I don't know, you know? And so, exploration and explore, like, is really something to deeply, deeply think about. And then how we relate to it as humans is also really, really important. Like, how do we interact with that? And when I say explore, do you get excited? And why is that? Whereas as an indigenous person, when people say explore, they use it as another way to conquer or to, like, explore comes with privilege, I think, is where I'm getting at. Is there's a lot of an immense amount of privilege in being able to explore. And so it's another colonial value. Is it
Hmm.
synonymous with success in a
Hmm.
colonial context? I don't know. There's a lot of things that I just said. If you would like to comment or share on any of that.
There's so much. Like I barely know where to begin. All excellent, all thoughtful, all eloquent. Um, so what I want to say first is that we're airing to an international audience, and so what I'll do is drop notes in the show notes, links in the show notes relating to things like residential schools, things like terra nullius, these violent tools of colonization that still have really severe and ongoing ramifications that aren't just historical and that occurred in the land now known as Canada, where we're coming from, which is now referred to as British Columbia, but also in the US and globally in many places. Um, so my dogs in my wall tent have a lot to say about this as well right now too. They feel the energy that I'm putting out into the world. So I guess so I'm you brought up something that really struck two things that struck particularly close that I want to sort of I just almost said that I want to explore more with you, that I want to dive into a bit. And the first is that exploration is in some cases synonymous with or a prerequisite uh, of privilege, or that that privilege is required if you're going to explore. And that is something that I think a lot of, or at least at Hidden Compass, storytellers and organizations, and hopefully particularly settler storytellers. Okay, I'm going to pause for a second. Settler storytellers, that's what it was. So, something that settler storytellers, I think, need to and hopefully are grappling with is, if we're going to travel, how do we do so in an ethical way? Is it possible? If it is, and we want to tell stories about that travel, how do we ensure that we aren't approaching those stories from exclusively a position of privilege and engaging in harm via that storytelling or that travel?
Can
And
I for one second?
yeah,
So even in that, I think about like climate action too. Even that responsibility of traveling
yeah,
and
yeah,
like how
please,
much jet fuel affects like affects all of that and the stats that we know on
totally,
that. And like I'm not highly educated on that. And like I just know probably what the average person knows, but just like as a little point of
yeah,
like ethically, when you talk about ethically traveling and all of that, it's like that's sort of also something that comes to mind.
totally,
Not so the people on the ground, and then what does our footprint look like? What does the impact of us taking a plane somewhere, which is big?
yeah. Especially relative to
Yeah,
the folks who may be
yeah.
unable to fly, who've contributed the least to climate change as it now exists. Um, I guess the other question I have, so I think about publications, particularly publications that frontline exploration, and the way those publications are beginning to change, not enough and not fast enough, but if you look at travel journalism or travel storytelling from, say, the 1970s or 80s, there is some pretty horrific exploitation, othering, colonization apparent in the pages of those journals, the photographs of non white bodies of naked non-white bodies. The double standards of journalism are so pervasive from those time periods. And I think it's something that the industry as a whole is yet to reconcile with continuing works, the storytellers in general. And so I wonder, there are so many words that have been reclaimed, but who reclaims them matters a lot. So an example that comes to mind is the word queer, which has been reclaimed by the LGBTQT plus community, the queer community, in a way that ultimately has been really empowering. But when it comes to reimagining a word like exploration, it seems inappropriate if white settlers, white non-indigenous folks are leading the charge in that reclamation. So I want to start by asking if you think reclamation of a word like exploration or explorer is possible, and if it is, what that might look like.
It's a good one. I kind of think no. I'm just like, no. And it's a really interesting one, and it comes with a lot of like I can't imagine. Well, I can't imagine, and I feel like queer has been reclaimed and is able to be reclaimed because it was used as a derogatory term towards people, whereas exploration um, always has sat in the hands of the colonizer.
Powerful, powerful.
Yeah, and that's what it is. And so it's maybe one of those things where it's like maybe we just got to give it up and we got to find a new word,
Hmm.
or maybe we need to step aside from exploring and from seeking that exploration, because that exploration, that colonization, that the root of explore, not like as like the root of the word, like in like
Its
linguistically,
roots, yeah,
but the root of the use of exploration, it's not rooted in respect.
yeah,
And so when I think about the ways that my ancestors traveled, like even I was out on the Kwakwana today, I was out on the canoe, and we were talking about how when you came to a land that wasn't your land, like you put your paddles up and the skipper said who we like, this is who we are. Like, well, if they were coming in peace, they would say they came in
yeah,
peace.
yeah,
If not, wouldn't. But it's like, can we come ashore?
yeah,
And so even in the way that my ancestors didn't explore, and because it's inherently exploring is to find something,
hmm,
or it's to get somewhere where no one's ever been before,
right,
and those places don't exist.
yeah,
It does not exist, a place that no one's ever been before, because all animals are connected to the land. Humans are an animal that is connected to the land.
yeah,
And so I don't think that exploration, well, can't be reclaimed because it's always been in the hands of the
hmm,
colonizer. And I think that it's like inherently a colonial term
yeah,
and needs to be replaced, maybe. But I think that, like, even in that, like, I feel like it's disappointing. Like, I feel like a wet blanket being like, nope. But at the same time, like, boundaries have not been
yeah,
respected.
for sure.
Like, people explored, like, even I think as a kid, when you're on the playground, you're like, I'm the tallest, I'm the king of the castle. Or like you climb a mountain and you're like, pretend to put a flag there. It's like, those are things that are maybe inherently within us, maybe they're learned things, but it's that ownership that I'm going to find something, and it's that selfishness that colonization is rooted in.
Yeah,
It's about me, and it's not
singularity.
about, yeah, the relationship. And I think when we think about even just like indigenous pedagogy, like relationships and
Hmm.
respect and
Hmm.
reciprocity, like none of those things have anything to do with exploration.
Yeah,
And I don't think it's possible for explore to be reclaimed, which is like kind of a big one.
yeah,
And it's really hard and sad for me sometimes, because I think about even the ways that like I rely on France, France. I rely on a lot of the work of Franz
for
Boas
sure.
and George Hunt,
Unfortunately,
who did a lot of work in the Kwakwakiwak
yeah,
territories, and they recorded a lot of language and they wrote it down. And I am in one way grateful that they did so much recording, because our ways aren't lost in that. And I know that there were a lot of colonizers across what is currently known as North America, what some people call Turtle Island. that explored and they came and they colonized, but they wrote a lot of things down about Indigenous people.
Hmm.
And on one hand, it's like I'm grateful to be able to read back and hear about my ancestors. But on the other hand, that would have never had to happen.
Yeah.
And like I wouldn't have to be grateful for these things if if we weren't, if people weren't actively trying, if we weren't actively assimilated, if we weren't murdered, if there wasn't Indigenous genocide that's actively going on. And we're finding kids
Yeah.
like by the thousands. And one of the things I was just talking about with my auntie is that we've known for years. Like we have known. Like my great grandparents who went to residential school, they knew. And all of these things that everybody's like, oh my God, it's such a shock. And it's like, no, we've always known, but you've always been too ignorant to listen.
Yeah.
And you've always been too busy exploring, too busy making flags, too busy saying like, "Wow, Canada's so great." And Indigenous peoples aren't the only people that have been assimilated or attemptedly assimilated. We're not the only people who were killed by the masses. Like, think about all the people that came and like in interior BC, there's was Japanese internment
Yeah.
camps, and like these are really big things, and there are so many. And you think about in southern North America, in how Black people were treated, and just the way that all of these ways that colonization has impacted so many minoritized
Hmm.
people,
Hmm.
and in the way that white people are still upheld.
Yeah.
The richest people in the world are still
Oh
white.
yeah.
And so, and they're still
Yeah.
exploring. Like they're exploring space
Oh my
now, and
God.
it's like, you know what? Like honestly, like you guys like need to get it
Yeah.
together. And like their GPD and like the way that wealth is still hoarded, and that's a really colonial concept,
Yeah.
to hoard
Yeah.
things. That breeds,
Absolutely.
and that lack of respect, that lack of relationship, that lack of reciprocity, that all started with
Yeah.
exploration. All started with Christopher Columbus looking for some spice.
Absolutely.
Actually, I don't know that
Well,
that's true, but
I
maybe.
think about, my fourth grade education in social studies in Sioux City, Iowa, in the US, and think about the absolute glorification of these explorers. And you're so right, and this is from a non-Indigenous perspective, but even now that word explorer is so interconnected to that early education about white violent men who were the first colonizers. And one thing I find, and I recognize and want to say out loud here, that in the context of talking about a word like this that has done so much harm to Indigenous peoples and essentially non white, non powerful people, my opinion matters less than Indigenous folks' opinion and everyone who's been harmed by this word, which, like, as you pointed out, is most folks. But one thing I find myself
Well,
wanting for,
if not all,
yeah, exactly.
I think we're all harmed by
Yeah.
colonization.
And hurt by it, just like, when it comes to like misogyny and patriarchy, toxic masculinity harms men too. Obviously, like, women are more harmed, and we shouldn't change the focus to how colonization has harmed the people who have benefited from it. But there are lots of harms, and we are living them in the form of things like climate change. Um, but I find myself wanting for a word. Words like exploration and discovery have these heavy, horrific, violent pasts, and have, as is the case with things like terra nullius, excused such violence. But there are things, non physical things, that I still use the term explorer, exploration for. And maybe that's for lack of a better word. So for instance, like
Yeah,
self exploration, or if I like have a feeling I need to unpack, I often feel like I'm exploring it. Or, in the case of thinking about climate solutions or conservation solutions or any number of these concepts, I find myself using the word explore a lot.
yeah,
And there are like, I want people to pursue discoveries, but not in the way
yeah.
we have thought about it in
Maybe
the past.
critically think. We can say,
Yeah,
let's. I want to critically think about this.
yeah, yeah. And like, I want
I'd like to critically think about this emotion for a minute, or like I'd like to critically think about solutions. I don't know.
I
That's what
I
came to me.
I like that, and maybe it's a diversity of words that we need. Because like one thing, I want new things, and some of that we need new ways. Like one example that comes to mind, and again, these may be like revisiting old ways, but in the context of police brutality in the US, I want new systems there. And I often find myself saying things like explore options or like discover new opportunities. And yeah, I feel like that's the space in which we need good language, reclaimed language, different language, not steeped in violence, to attend to like all of these ways we can find better approaches for, better relationships with, better like systems for, uh, and we lack like the language, and maybe this is English as a language that's a problem, as rooted in.
Maybe. Or maybe we can just start changing it and it'll come along.
Mhm.
Because like I think that's how we'll make a slang. That's a Yeah, I think that's really important. I'd like to, before I know we're on a time crunch ish, but I think it's really important to talk about land back. Because, like, the sort of the counter to exploration is like land back, like, give it back. And it's really interesting, the concept of land back, because settlers get really uncomfortable. They're like, whoa, do you want us all to move away? And it's like, well, like, no, but like, if you're going to be an asshole, maybe. I hope I could swear. But I think it's really important to understand that the relationships that the indigenous people have wherever your land is are so deep and so ancestrally strong that that's what it's going to take. And it's actually also a responsibility of indigenous people to understand and to seek out their knowledge keepers and their hereditary people whose who are not seeped in colonial brain. And I talk about colonial brain a lot just in my life because colonization has deeply impacted a lot of us, and greed and money and like chief and council is a colonial construct, and all of these things that a lot of non-indigenous people fall to, being like, well, you're chief and council, and it's like, but that's not the way it was. And we don't need to go back fully to the way it was, but we need to understand that we need to honor and respect our ancestors, and we need to check ourselves sometimes when we're in colonial brain, because everything I learn about what my culture and my people and my ancestors, greed was the very last thing, and I see so much greed everywhere right now. And land back doesn't mean just giving it back, but it means honoring the relationships of the people whose land you are on. And if you are a rich person who has a lot of land, maybe it does physically mean giving it back. And I think that's really, really important. And maybe it means ensuring that you're supporting language in whatever community you're in. Maybe your first step is to just learn about the people whose lands you're on, because no matter where you are on an indigenous person's land. And do you know their names? Do you know the name of the nation? Do you know that they have an immense relationship with the land, and through their language communicate to the land all over everywhere, and that there are so many different groups of indigenous people in so many areas. And I'm not anything like, well, maybe I'm a little bit like a Cree person, but like my traditions don't align with Cree all the time, or Haudenosaunee, or Mi'kmaq, or Inuit. And I think that's something that is also very colonial thinking, like, oh, all indigenous peoples. But where you are on, those people have specific traditions, they have specific beliefs, they have specific ways that they interact with the land, and have interacted with the land for tens of thousands of years. And so the counter to exploration is land back. And maybe instead of taking a trip somewhere, you should be investing that money in the peoples whose land you're on. And maybe that's one way that you can have land back, you know? And sometimes it means stepping out of the spotlight,
Hmm.
which is like a really, really big thing. And it's how are you making sure that you're not taking up too much space, or
God, yeah.
you're not taking away from the people who have lived there forever. And land back does mean land back, like physically, but there are other ways to get there, and there are steps to get there. But if you are a rich person and you have a lot of money and a lot of land, like, people deserve to have their traditional territory back. And that's, people deserve to trap on the line, their trap lines they've used for hundreds of thousands of years, and fish in the rivers that they have. Our rivers are drying, or not drying, our fish aren't able to go home. And our fish population, especially on the West Coast, is really down. And that's an impact of pipelines and logging. And it's, the rivers aren't sustainable anymore. So what are the next steps?
Yeah. I love
What
this.
are the next ways?
Yeah. And I love this as a place to sort of like wrap and conclude this conversation, because this is such a powerful antidote to the brokenness in the system. And also, I balancing optimism, and an ability to take action in a good way in a world that has so many challenges can feel really hard. But finishing in this way is a call to action if you want to travel responsibly, if you want to learn new things. You can very well do so in your own backyard by deepening your relationship with that space, by starting with deepening and improving your relationship with the peoples whose lands you're on. And that may not mean like a person to person relationship. That may mean, you know, repatriating is also a
Can I
word.
interject
Yeah,
that?
go for it.
I think it's really important, like before we start demanding work out of Indigenous people, being like, I need to go figure out them. I think the first step is figuring out ourselves. And
Yeah,
so, like,
100%.
maybe if you are going to travel, go to your homelands,
Yeah.
like, go to wherever you're from, and really do that self work. Like, there are a lot of really good resources that help us here and now. Like, Me and White Supremacy is a really good book. And there are a lot of resources like that that can help push our boundaries of who am I? What are my values?
Yeah.
What are my beliefs? What has been indoctrinated in me?
Yeah.
But then also knowing that, yeah, those things are really uncomfortable and they're the truth. But also, I have somewhere that I can go, and maybe I have many places. Maybe I'm from many places. Maybe you're from
Mhm.
many places. And you have places you can go to so that you can understand how we feel on our
Yeah,
lands
totally.
and why things are so sacred to us.
Well, and
And so I think that that's just, I just wanted to add that
I
in.
love that. And I think, in, I don't want to clarify, I don't want to encourage folks to make work for the indigenous peoples of whose territories they live on by like seeking to strengthen personal relationships. Though if that is a position that is useful, if you're in that position, great. That may mean things like, critically analyzing how you can give back, how you can repatriate, which is another word, like rematriate maybe is better, how we can recognize where we've been privileged as non-indigenous folks. This is self-referential, but by violent colonization, and recognize that there are all these relationships we don't understand on the land that we live on, and part of ethically being, whether that is where you live or whether that's somewhere 30 minutes away from your home or whether that's like a continent away, means reckoning with colonization, means reckoning with the relationships in that place, means identifying how and if you can improve the way you are in that space. And this is where like I come back to
I
this like
haven't
self
done
exploration, because and maybe it's unpacking, like maybe it's deconstruction, self deconstruction, I don't know, I need a word, but yeah, I think that's a wonderful like action item. Is if you feel this urge to do better, if you feel this urge to ethically travel, or like there are ways to do it that reconcile with the
If you
truth.
want to give, if you have extra money and like want to give extra money, like the hashtag Settler Saturday on Twitter, like
Hmm.
people need help. Indigenous
Yeah.
people like are deeply impacted by colonization, and if you have extra money, like search the hashtag Settler Saturday, and like you can actually like make an impact on people's lives now.
Yeah,
And that's just one way. And there are lots of ways, and I'm sure there are people in your own community too that are deeply impacted by colonization.
absolutely.
That if you have the funds, start engaging in community care and community support.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. I'm also watching time, and I don't know if the listeners have heard any of this, but just to like lighten things briefly, uh, there have been geese screaming outside the wall tent, and my dogs are losing their minds. And also, really adorably, one of my dogs just like maybe was vomiting in the back corner of the wall tent stereo. So I'm a very professional YouTube person, as you can tell by everything that's been going on. But besides all those distractions, I just want to give you the floor for the last couple minutes. We've got about 5 minutes left. I am so grateful for everything you shared today. And, in the broader context of we live in a world in need of storytelling. If there's anyone we can learn from in that sense, it's a number of Indigenous individuals and diverse Indigenous nations. How, and you've sort of already done this by bringing land back into the picture, which should be center to the narrative. And I've, of course, for listeners, will link all in and anything you may need to learn more in show notes. Do you have any other thoughts you want to share about storytelling or about discovery or exploration, whether that exploration be physical, as we sort of described, or other, other?
I think it's big stuff, and exploration, and there's I think it really makes me think too of the white savior complex,
Yeah.
and the work that I've done. And I've worked with an organization called Transformative Praxis Malawi as an undergrad, with the Snowbanks, and it was a really incredible program. Like we went to Malawi for 5 weeks, and we asked some really big questions like, should we be here? Should we be doing this? And what does sustainability look like? And what does continual relationships look like? And we like joke, there's a really good Instagram, and I don't know if it's still active, but it's called White Savior Barbie. And these are really big things that we need to think about. And there's also No White Saviors, an Instagram account. And as someone who was raised predominantly in a non-indigenous community, all of those things are things that I've had to work through and that contribute to my story of how I got to where I am. And like I'm very grateful to be now in a space where I can fully be myself. And I didn't even realize that I wasn't fully myself until I started learning about myself and my history and my ancestors' history on every side. And it really makes a difference when we start being able to like be our true selves, and it makes a difference when we connect with our elders all over. And like there's just so much value in all old people. That is another colonial construct where it's like people are not valued, humans are not valued the way they should be valued, especially our old people. And I've always been very connected to old people, and it's really really important to spend time with them. And like obviously some people have their flaws, as we all know. I feel like we've all got like the racist, like a racist grandparent or a great uncle, or there's always things.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like there is so much value in listening to other people's stories, and it's just incredible. Even like I went to a wedding recently, and I sat down with the groom's grandma, who I'd never met before, and like just the knowledge that she holds and the skills that she holds. And it's really really important when I think about storytelling is to make sure that we're letting people tell their stories, and we're asking our old people we're asking them questions, and having them like giving them the opportunity to tell their stories. And we can learn so much from that, because if I feel like our culture right now is really focused on youth, and it's focused on just making that the center point, when there's so much knowledge that is in our old people and so many
Hmm.
skills, that things that like my friend Nono was telling me how he makes prosciutto from like January to April every year. Like he makes his own prosciutto, and it's like damn, those skills are
Yeah.
so important.
Yeah.
And those traditions and that ceremony in their family.
Yeah.
And so there's things across all cultures that are so valuable. And we're so busy sometimes, and like I know that I've traveled and I've experienced so much privilege in that,
Hmm.
and have gone and done young people things, but there's so much knowledge at home, and there's so many people who are so undervalued. And I
Yeah.
think that when it comes to storytelling, ask people to tell their stories and really like and let them talk about it, and like let them and just listen. And huklila is how you say to my language, but it's like really huklila, because like that's it.
Yeah.
And it was the same thing when we went to Malawi. We made relationships, and there were people who I made relationships, and the longevity of that program is really really important. And the relationships built in that program, that is another sticky situation. Like, do we belong here? Should we be here?
Yeah.
and and that's a huge thing, and that's something that I know the director of that program is constantly like, he has relationships, really beautiful relationships with, and like friends,
Yeah.
like
Yeah. Of
Malawian
course.
friends, and those things are so important. And like like a good indigenous academic, I will say it all starts in
Yeah.
relationships and reciprocity. And not that's kind of a joke, but it's like doing things in that good way, which
Yeah.
has kind of turned into a buzzword.
It has.
But at the end of the day, it's like, are we being respectful to the lands? Are we being respectful to the animals? Are we respecting people? Are we respecting
Yeah.
ourselves?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of ways that we behave in the colonial society that don't respect ourselves. And like, even in the way that we have to think critically about ourselves, and we have to explore our feelings, like as if we have to do
Oh,
that.
yeah.
And like colonization.
Yeah.
It's the money, it's
Yeah.
capitalism, it's
Yeah.
greed. It's like,
I
how can
think,
I be the best in the capitalistic society? And we don't have to do that.
no.
And like,
And
you think you have to, do it, but you don't.
what I really loved about that is in your lovely explanation of storytelling and all its shapes, and those who hold stories not having opportunities to share them always, like one alternative to exploration. And this is something that being raised in a colonial culture has made something I've had to work really hard on and still have to work really hard on, is that listening rather than personally exploring is.
We're going to learn so much more by listening. You learn so much more.
And listening, I like, this is something colleagues of mine in the spaces I work in will say we have 2 ears, so we listen twice and one mouth to speak once. And I it is really something that I have been pretty bad at historically. Um, and I'm sure that's due to many things, but one of the things is that we're in a system that uplifts loud individuals, and listening is devalued. So that's a lovely, in the context of talking about exploration, that's like a really nice juxtaposition to what like active physical exploration might look like. So I love that.
Kayla, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for joining me. Kristen has joined me many a times on the Witch podcast, where we get even more ragey.
You want to hear us talk more?
We are never particularly good at brevity. We could talk much, much longer, but for now, we'll cap our wonderful chat here. And yeah, we will share links to all of your resources. Anything you want to plug really quick here at the end?
I don't know. Support local Indigenous language revitalization wherever you are, whatever your community. Support it, support land back, support Indigenous creators from where you are and from your territory. And like, there's a lot of beautiful stuff on Instagram, like just, and Twitter too. And so just, I don't know, be critical. If you, I'm going to task you, ask an old person how they are, or ask them something cool that happened in their life, because like I'm always blown away. And I'm like, I'm so sorry I didn't ask you sooner.
I know, right? My life has changed fundamentally. Yeah, yeah.
Right. Always get
for joining, and we'll be back soon some more.